This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to our series on modern spiritual movements. Today we explore the 12 Tribes, a communal organization known for its inviting yellow delis and artisan crafts. While presenting a facade of peace and restoration, the group's internal world is defined by absolute authority, controversial child-rearing, and a rigid racial hierarchy. We will trace their evolution from a 1970s Tennessee ministry to a global stone kingdom. What is the true price of seeking a first-century utopia in the modern world? Join us as we examine the impact of this community on its members and society. Chapter text. Chapter 1. The Stone Kingdom, Origins of the 12 Tribes. Chapter 1. The Stone Kingdom, Origins of the 12 Tribes. In the early 1970s, the United States was a landscape of deep social unrest and spiritual seeking. The counterculture movement had left a generation of young people disillusioned with traditional institutions, including the mainstream church. It was against this backdrop that Elbert Eugene Spriggs, a man who would eventually be known to thousands as Yonek, began a small ministry in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Gene Spriggs was not a typical fire and brimstone preacher. He had worked as a personnel manager and a high school guidance counselor, experiencing the traditional world and finding it wanting. Within the growing circle of his followers, Spriggs was regarded as more than just a leader. He was the Anointed One, a figure believed to have a direct pipeline to divine revelation. This spiritual mantle would define the movement until his death on January 11, 2021, at his property in Hiddenite, North Carolina. Yet his teachings continue to serve as the absolute law for his followers. Along with his wife Marcia, Spriggs began to reach out to the teenagers and hippies who were wandering the streets of Chattanooga, looking for something solid to hold on to. The movement began modestly in 1972 as a teenagers' ministry called the Light Brigade for Jesus Christ. The base of operations was a small coffee shop called the Lighthouse, located right in the Spriggs' home. It was a place where young people could find a warm meal, a listening ear, and a sense of belonging that many had never experienced before. The atmosphere was one of intense fellowship. Bible study sessions would stretch long into the night, fueled by a shared desire to find a deeper spiritual truth. As the group grew, the boundaries between private life and ministry began to blur. People started bringing their sleeping bags and moving in with the Spriggses, sharing their resources and their lives in a way that mirrored the communal patterns of the early Christians. To support this growing family, the group opened a small health food restaurant called the Yellow Deli. It was more than just a business. It was envisioned as a court of the Gentiles, a place where the community could interact with the public and demonstrate their values through hospitality and hard work. The members renovated 5 Victorian houses in Chattanooga, expressing their doctrine of restoration through the physical repair of old, neglected structures. At this stage, the group did not see itself as a separate denomination. They were simply a group of believers trying to live out their faith with sincerity. They attended the First Presbyterian Church in Chattanooga, but their presence there quickly became a source of friction. The members of the Light Brigade did not fit the social profile of the established congregation. They brought in people from different social classes and racial groups, a practice that was not common in the religious establishment of Chattanooga at the time. Local friction intensified as the group's influence grew. The severity of this local opposition was such that several nearby religious institutions, fearing the group's influence on their own populations, took formal action. Bryan College in Dayton, Tennessee, Temple University in Chattanooga, and Covenant College in Georgia all officially banned their students from patronizing the Yellow Deli. Despite this, the group expanded their presence in downtown Chattanooga, opening a second cafe named Areopagus, intended to be a place of philosophical and spiritual debate. The friction with the religious establishment reached a breaking point on January 12, 1975. Gene Spriggs and his followers arrived at the First Presbyterian Church for the Sunday morning service, only to find the doors locked and a sign posted. The service had been canceled because of the Super Bowl. For Spriggs, this was a moment of profound revelation. He saw it as proof that the mainstream church had abandoned God for the idols of the world. It was the catalyst that led the group to withdraw from the religious mainstream and form the Vine Christian Community Church. This break was the beginning of a radical quest to recreate the first-century church as described in the book of Acts. Spriggs began to teach that the modern church was fallen and that a complete restoration was necessary. He pointed to the scriptures in Acts chapters 2 and 4, which describe the early disciples as being of one heart and soul, holding all things in common and selling their possessions to ensure no one among them was in need. This was not just a historical account to Spriggs, it was a command. He believed that for the Messiah to return, the church had to be restored to this original communal form. The group eventually adopted the name the 12 Tribes, a title derived from the Apostle Paul's words in Acts chapter 26, verse 7, to which our 12 tribes, earnestly serving God night and day, hope to attain. The group's withdrawal from the mainstream turned the initial friction into a full-scale outcry from the Chattanooga community. They began holding their own services, which they called Critical Mass, in Warner Park. Spriggs started baptizing people in local ponds without any denominational authority, an act that deeply alienated the local Christian community. As the group became more isolationist, they attracted the attention of organized opposition. Generic negative press was replaced by targeted campaigns from organizations like the Parents Committee to Free Our Children from the Children of God and the Citizens Freedom Foundation. Despite the pressure and a series of forced deprogrammings, the group continued to expand, planting churches and opening yellow delis in surrounding towns, including Dalton and Trenton, Georgia, Mentone, Alabama, and Dayton, Tennessee. The theological vision that drove this expansion was rooted in a specific interpretation of the book of Daniel. Spriggs believed he had received a revelation about Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a great statue, known as the Colossus. In the dream, the statue had a head of gold, a chest of silver, thighs of bronze, and legs of iron. The feet were a mixture of iron and clay. According to the group's teaching, these metals represented successive worldly empires: Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. The feet of iron and clay represented the modern world, specifically a corrupted alliance between the state and organized religion. Because they viewed all worldly governments as part of this doomed statue, members were, and remain, strictly forbidden from participating in secular politics, refusing to vote in elections or align themselves with any earthly power. In the dream, a stone was cut out of a mountain without human hands and struck the statue on its feet, causing the entire structure to crumble into dust. The stone then grew into a mountain that filled the whole earth. Spriggs taught that his community was that stone. They were the Stone Kingdom, a new spiritual nation being chipped away from the mountain of the world to bring about the end of the present age. This millenarian belief gave the members a sense of ultimate purpose. They weren't just living together, they were building the kingdom of God on earth, a necessary prerequisite for the return of the Messiah. By the late 1970s, the pressure in Chattanooga had become intense. In 1978, the group received an invitation to minister at a small church in Island Pond, Vermont. Although the initial offer to take over the church was declined, the group began moving to the rural town in stages. They eventually closed down their businesses in the south, except for one deli in Dalton, and relocated their base of operations to the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. They named their new congregation the Northeast Kingdom Community Church. The move was a period of extreme economic hardship, and the isolation of the rural setting caused some members to leave. But for those who stayed, it was a time of further spiritual evolution. It was in Island Pond during the mid-1980s that the group's identity as the 12 Tribes began to fully take shape. Spriggs believed that the restoration of the church required the recreation of the 12 tribes of Israel. This was not a literal ethnic claim, but a spiritual one. They believed they were the spiritual Israel, a confederation of 12 tribes that would eventually be located in 12 geographic regions across the globe. About this time, the community began to distance itself even further from traditional Christianity. They stopped using the name Jesus, opting instead for what they believed was the original Hebrew name, Yahshua. Spriggs himself took the Hebrew name Yonek, meaning sapling or sprig. The culture of the group became increasingly distinctive. They began to incorporate Israeli folk dancing and music into their worship, seeing it as a way to express their new tribal identity. In the summer of 1987, the entire community in Island Pond underwent a ritual baptism. For the members, this was a symbolic act of washing themselves clean from the flaws of contemporary Christianity and fully committing to the life of the Stone Kingdom. They saw themselves as the pure and spotless bride preparing for the return of her king. The group's lifestyle became a physical manifestation of their beliefs. Men grew beards and wore their hair tied back, while women dressed in modest, long skirts and headscarves, symbolizing their submission to the elders and to Yahshua. They abandoned the use of banks and personal savings, pooling all their money into a common treasury. Every member gave up their earthly possessions upon joining, a practice they believed was essential to becoming a true disciple. This renunciation of the world was meant to foster a sense of total dependence on the community and on God. The daily rhythm of life in the community was centered around 2 mandatory gatherings, one in the morning and one in the evening. These were times for worship, prayer, and sharing insights from the teachings of Spriggs. The members lived in large multi-family households where every aspect of life was shared. They worked together in cottage industries, primarily bakeries and construction crews, viewing their labor as a form of worship. They sought to be self-sufficient, growing their own food and making their own clothes, creating a society that they believed was free from the corruption of the modern world. As the 1980s progressed, the group began to look beyond the borders of Vermont. They used unique methods to reach out to the lost, including following the Grateful Dead on tour with a double-decker bus. They offered free medical aid and food to the concert-goers, inviting them to join their circle dances and visit their communities. This outreach was highly effective, drawing in young people who were searching for an alternative to the mainstream. By 1989, the group had grown substantially and began opening branches in other countries. This international expansion was spearheaded by a group known as the Little Flock, members who wandered through Europe for a year before establishing the first international community, Tabitha's Place, in Sousse, France. During this period of expansion, the group used the name Messianic Communities, but by 1995, they officially adopted the name the 12 Tribes. They organized themselves into geographic regions, each representing one of the biblical tribes. For example, the community in the American Southeast was designated as the Tribe of Benjamin. This structure was meant to reflect their vision of a global, unified nation of believers. Each community was self-governing, but remained under the spiritual authority of the Apostolic Council, a group of elders who oversaw the movement. This global network is anchored by the community in Hiddenite, North Carolina, which serves as the group's international headquarters and intertribal community conference center, a central hub where the tribes gather to maintain their unity. The theological framework of the group also introduced the concept of the 3 eternal destinies. Spriggs taught that all of humanity would eventually fall into one of 3 categories: the holy, the righteous, or the wicked. The holy were the members of the 12 tribes themselves, the only ones who would reign with Yahshua. The righteous were those outside the group who followed their conscience and natural law, while the wicked were those who rejected God and faced eternal destruction. Central to this mission was the raising of the 144,000. This eschatological timeline became even more specific in recent years. The group believes that a final 49-year race began on Passover, April 22, 2022. This period is expected to culminate in the 50th year, 2070, which they believe will be a year of Jubilee, marking the return of Yahshua. Every action within the community, from the way they manage their businesses to the way they raise their children, is viewed through the lens of this approaching deadline. The quest for the first-century church was also a quest for a specific kind of family life. Spriggs taught that the breakdown of the family was the root cause of society's decay. In the 12 tribes, the family was seen as the building block of the kingdom. Parents were given total authority over their children, and homeschooling was mandatory, to ensure that the next generation was not corrupted by the values of the world. The goal was to raise children who were perfectly obedient and ready to serve the community's mission. This focus on the family, however, was also where the group would face its greatest challenges and most intense public scrutiny.
The group's insistence on total submission to authority extended from the children to the adults. Every member was expected to obey the elders, who in turn were expected to follow the teachings of Spriggs. This hierarchical structure was seen as the divine order, a way to ensure unity and eliminate the independent spirit that the group believed led to sin. For the members, this wasn't seen as a loss of freedom, but as a path to true liberation from the self. They believed that by laying down their lives for one another, they were experiencing the love of God in a way that was impossible in the outside world. As the group established its 12 tribes across the globe, the reality of this life would be tested by the experiences of the members and the scrutiny of the societies around them. Chapter 2. The Common Purse, Labor, Taxes, and the Deli Facade.
When you walk into a yellow deli, the first thing you notice is the atmosphere. It is a world of warm amber lighting, hand-carved cedar booths, and the comforting aroma of freshly steamed sandwiches and homemade soup. The decor is rustic and intentional, often featuring intricate stonework and wrought iron that suggests a simpler, more honest era. The people behind the counter are unfailingly polite, dressed in modest, earth-toned clothing, their hair often tied back in simple styles. To a weary traveler or a hungry college student, it feels like a sanctuary. This is the public face of the 12 tribes, a carefully curated window into their communal life. As the group's own website states, we hope that through having an open and hospitable place, people will be able to see that we are not really strange and scary. Yet, behind the rustic charm of the deli counter lies the engine of a global economic powerhouse built on a foundation of total surrender and unpaid labor. The Yellow Deli is not a typical restaurant chain. It is the visible tip of an international confederation that operates dozens of businesses across 16 states and 10 countries, supporting a population estimated between 2,500 and 5,000 members. From construction firms and printing presses to organic food distribution and international tea markets, the 12 Tribes has mastered the art of vertical integration. But unlike any other corporate entity, their most valuable asset is a labor force that works for no wages, receives no benefits, and has no personal bank accounts.
The economic reality of the 12 tribes begins the moment a new member joins. The group requires a total renunciation of all earthly possessions. If a person enters the community with a car, a house, or a retirement fund, those assets are liquidated and the money is handed over to the common purse. This common treasury funds the acquisition of new properties, the expansion of businesses, and the daily maintenance of the tribe. In exchange, the community promises to meet all their needs. This creates a closed economic loop where the individual is entirely dependent on the collective for survival. To the outside world, this looks like a massive volunteer operation, but the legal structure is more complex. In the United States, the group often operates as a 501(d) organization. This is a specific tax designation for religious or apostolic associations that have a common treasury. Under this status, the group can engage in for-profit businesses, but the income is technically treated as if it were the personal income of the members divided among them as shares. However, because the members live so modestly and the group's expenses are so high, the individual shares of the income often fall below the threshold for filing taxes. The result is a multi-million-dollar network of businesses that pays property taxes but often manages to avoid a significant portion of the income tax burden that would cripple a traditional competitor. The labor itself is framed as a form of worship. In the 12 tribes, there is no distinction between secular work and spiritual service. This philosophy allows the group to maintain a grueling pace of operation. In places like Vista, California, or Boulder, Colorado, the Yellow Deli has been known to operate 24 hours a day, 5 days a week, closing only for the Sabbath. Because the workers are members of the community living in nearby households, the group can rotate shifts without the overhead costs of overtime pay or payroll taxes. While the delis are the most visible part of their empire, the group's construction businesses are perhaps even more lucrative. Operating under names like BOJ Construction in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and Commonwealth Construction, the 12 Tribes sends out crews of men who are often highly skilled in traditional crafts like timber framing and stonework. These crews take on high-end residential and commercial projects for the world, providing a massive influx of cash to the common purse. Because the labor is unpaid, these companies can offer competitive bids while still generating significant profit margins. Former members have described these construction jobs as exhausting marathons, where men work long hours away from their families, driven by the belief that their sweat is building a divine kingdom. The group's reach extends into the global commodities market through the mate factor. This business serves as a perfect example of their vertical integration. The yerba mate tea is grown on their own farm in Brazil, processed and packaged in their facility in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and then shipped to be sold in their cafes in Savannah, Georgia, and Manitou Springs, Colorado. They even operate tribal trading, an organic food distribution network in Spain. This closed loop ensures that the group controls every step of the supply chain, from the field to the cup, maximizing the profit that returns to the common treasury. This self-sufficient economy is further supported by a network of farms and cottage industries. At the Stony Brook Farm Market in Virginia, they sell organic produce directly to the public. At the Common Sense Farm in Cambridge, New York, they produce soaps and body care products under the brand Greener Formulas. To maintain these sprawling agricultural operations, the group has found ways to tap into labor sources beyond their own membership. They actively recruit through the WWOOF, Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farms Network, and various work-for-stay programs, drawing in idealistic travelers who provide free labor in exchange for room and board, often unaware of the group's deeper theological underpinnings. The group also operates Parchment Press, a sophisticated printing operation that produces their literature and educational materials. This ensures that their message is always available and that they never have to rely on outside services to maintain their internal culture. The efficiency of this model is undeniable, but it has repeatedly brought the group into conflict with labor authorities. The most significant controversies have centered on the use of children in their businesses. The 12 Tribes believes that children should be integrated into the life of the community from a young age, which includes working alongside their parents. They view this as a form of apprenticeship, teaching children responsibility and practical skills. However, to state and federal investigators, this often looks like illegal child labor. In 2001, the New York State Department of Labor launched an investigation into the Common Sense Farm after reports surfaced that children were working in the group's soap factory. The investigation was triggered when Estée Lauder, which had a contract with the group, discovered minors assisting in the production process during a random inspection. The beauty giant immediately terminated its contract, as did Robert Redford's Sundance catalog, which had been purchasing furniture from the group's woodworks. The 12 Tribes responded with a press conference, making no apologies for their practices. They argued that they were a family-owned business and that their children were simply helping their parents. The group often portrays labor citations as examples of government pettiness.
They frequently cite a $2,000 fine they received in New York involving a 15-year-old. The group claimed the state was being unreasonable for fining them over a teenager pushing a wheelbarrow and another changing a light bulb. To the 12 tribes, these were not violations of labor law, but the natural activities of a child helping their family. The issue resurfaced in 2018 when an undercover investigation by a news outlet revealed children working in the same New York soap factory manufacturing private label body care products for brands like Acure and Savannah Bee. Once again, the brands involved cut ties with the group, and the New York State Department of Labor issued multiple citations. The Yellow Deli people have even turned their hospitality into a recruitment tool. The delis are designed to be unobtrusive in their evangelism, but they serve as the primary entry point for new members. One of their most effective methods is a weekly Bible study called Nicodemus at Night, held at the communities or cafes to draw in the public. A customer might come in for a sandwich and leave with an invitation to a late-night discussion about a brand-new culture. The staff is trained to be welcoming and to engage in conversations that might pique a visitor's interest in their communal lifestyle.
A significant milestone in their economic history occurred in 2008 when the group opened a new Yellow Deli in Chattanooga, Tennessee. This was a powerful full-circle moment for the movement as they returned to the city that had driven them out nearly 30 years earlier. The reopening was framed as a restoration, proving that their economic model could not only survive but thrive and return to its roots despite decades of opposition. The economy of the 12 tribes is a closed loop. The money generated from the delis, construction sites, and international trade is used to buy more land and start more businesses, which in turn require more labor from more members. It is a system designed for growth and survival, but it is one that requires the total absorption of the individual into the collective. The leadership, structured as a series of councils, manages the distribution of resources from the common purse. While the community claims that everyone's needs are met equally, the pressure to generate revenue is constant. Even with a global network of businesses, the group is not immune to the financial pressures of the world they claim to have transcended. In 2022, their prominent compound in Ithaca, New York, a cornerstone of their presence in the Northeast, faced foreclosure proceedings by Bank of America.
This economic model, while successful in sustaining the group for over 50 years, remains a point of deep concern for labor advocates. They see a system that exploits sincere religious devotion to build a global empire, where adults are worked to the point of exhaustion without the protections afforded to every other worker in society. The group's physical presence in these communities has also led to catastrophic friction. In late 2021, the 12 tribes became the center of a massive criminal investigation following the Marshall Fire in Boulder County, Colorado. The fire, which destroyed over 1,000 homes and became the most destructive in state history, was investigated for its potential origin on the group's property, where witnesses reported seeing a small fire burning in a shed on the morning the blaze ignited. The rustic facade of the Yellow Deli, with its warm wood and friendly smiles, is the gateway to a system that demands everything from its members.
For the children born within the 12 tribes, life is defined by a rigorous preparation for the end of the world. They are taught that they are the potential members of the 144,000, a holy army raised without the stain of modernity, and that they will one day do battle with the forces of the Evil One during the apocalyptic events of Revelation. To achieve this, the group has developed a system of child-rearing that is perhaps the most scrutinized aspect of their existence. It is a world where toys are forbidden, fantasy is considered a lie, and the primary tool of instruction is a thin, flexible wooden rod. The group's philosophy is rooted in the belief that a child's natural will is rebellion that must be broken for submission to authority. Jean Spriggs frequently taught that the moral decline of modern society was a direct result of the permissive parenting advice of Dr. Benjamin Spock, whose focus on child-centered needs was seen by the group as a blueprint for lawlessness.
To counter this perceived cultural rot, the group mandates a process of submission that begins in infancy. According to the group's internal 348-page child training manual, the rod should be introduced as early as 6 months. If a baby wiggles during a diaper change or reaches for a forbidden object, parents are instructed to administer a sting to the child's bottom. The rationale is that this pain is humbling, teaching submission from the cradle to save the child from sin and eternal damnation. The physical tool is often described as a reed-like rod, a thin wooden stick similar to those used to hold balloons. In public literature, the 12 Tribes calls this loving correction, a biblical mandate misunderstood by secular society. However, former members describe a far more severe reality. Children spanked 20 or 30 times a day for minor offenses, like asking for second helpings, fidgeting during worship, or failing to respond immediately to a command. Discipline extends beyond the rod to total behavioral control. Children must sit perfectly still for hours during gatherings. Any restlessness prompts immediate removal for a spanking. This creates an environment of constant surveillance, where parents are corrected by elders if seen as weak in discipline. The group teaches that a child's disobedience reflects the parent's bad conscience or failure to represent God's authority. Physical restraint is also used to break a child's spirit. Holding sessions involve pinning a tantrum-throwing toddler on an adult's lap, arms restrained and a hand over the mouth, for an hour or more until surrender. After discipline, the child must thank the punisher and apologize for rebellion, while refraining from crying. This ritual, believed to build character through reproof and instruction, ensures the child harbors no grudge, which would contaminate their conscience. This institutionalized approach has sparked decades of legal battles across continents. The Island Pond Raid of June 22, 1984, set a crucial legal precedent when the court ruled the warrant unconstitutional due to generalized suspicion rather than specific evidence, a victory the group used for decades to claim persecution and vindication. However, subsequent cases provided concrete evidence. In 2000, a Connecticut couple from the 12 Tribes pleaded guilty to third-degree assault and cruelty to persons for hitting their children with a fiberglass rod, a conviction that demonstrated the legal system's willingness to prosecute when evidence was clear. The legal tide shifted notably in Europe. Long before the more recent raids, the group had already drawn the attention of European governments. In 1995, a French parliamentary committee report officially classified the 12 Tribes as a sect, signaling a growing international concern over their communal practices. In September 2013, German authorities raided 2 communities in Bavaria after undercover journalist Wolfram König captured footage of systematic beatings with rods. 40 children were removed. The group fought to the European Court of Human Rights, which in 2018 upheld Germany's actions. The court accepted parents' right to pass on moral convictions in an insistent and overbearing manner, but drew the line at physical or psychological harm, characterizing the rod as institutionalized violence. This ruling forced the group to largely abandon Germany, relocating to the Czech Republic. Educational practices further isolate children. Homeschooled with a group-developed curriculum, focus is on the Bible and their interpretations. Outside books, television, and secular music are forbidden. The group teaches that modern education is a tool of the evil one, designed to fill minds with independent thoughts. By age 13, formal schooling often gives way to apprenticeships, where boys work in construction or farms and girls in domestic duties, as detailed in Chapter 2. This isolation means children have no concept of life outside. They celebrate no birthdays or holidays, seen as self-centered. They are taught that leavers will be struck down by God or wander in misery. For a child never exposed to media, leaving is terrifying, creating a psychological wall as effective as physical isolation. In Australia, the group faced scrutiny in 2020 when police searched Peppercorn Creek Farm after allegations from former elder Scott Chen Zarnecki. He claimed abusive discipline and unreported stillborn burials. Forensic experts found at least one infant's remains. The investigation continued amid tension, compounded by Zarnecki's murder shortly after speaking out, though a teenager was later charged.
The impact on children who leave is profound, often resulting in the arrested development and lack of basic life skills described elsewhere. Trauma from daily discipline and pressure to be perfect leads to anxiety, depression, and shattered identity. Some report sexual abuse ignored to protect community reputation, while medical neglect underscores the lack of support. This neglect is often rooted in a general rejection of modern medical treatment in favor of faith healing and natural remedies. Within the community, illness is frequently viewed not as a biological reality, but as a sign of spiritual failure or a bad conscience that requires repentance rather than a doctor. Despite raids, rulings, and testimonies, the 12 tribes maintains their approach is righteous. They see the wisdom of the rod as foundational, setting them apart from a crumbling world. They defend isolating and disciplining children by Scripture, viewing state intervention as spiritual battle between the stone kingdom and the world. This stance remains central, ensuring continued conflict with law enforcement and human rights advocates globally. The group's insistence on total submission ensures organizational survival by shaping the next generation from infancy, creating a workforce and faithful remnant knowing no other reality. For the children, the world is divided into tribe safety and nation's danger. Every spanking and labor hour is framed as protection against corruption. They are told they are special and chosen, but at the cost of a childhood defined by the rod's threat and erasure of individual identity. Chapter 4: The Curse of Cham, Racial Hierarchy and the Holy Nation. To a casual visitor sitting in the warm wood-paneled interior of a yellow deli, the 12 tribes appears to be a model of racial harmony. You might see a black man in a hand-sewn tunic sharing a meal with a white family, or a mixed-race group of young people laughing as they prepare artisan bread. The group's public-facing literature often features photographs of diverse members smiling in sun-drenched fields, and their frequently asked questions page explicitly denies any accusations of racism, claiming that within their community, the death of their Messiah has removed all hostility between the races. They present themselves as a melting pot where national and ethnic identities are surrendered in favor of a new spiritual culture. But for those who move beyond the deli counter and deeper into the inner teachings of the group, a much darker and more rigid racial hierarchy begins to emerge. The theological foundation for this hierarchy is found in a specific and controversial interpretation of the biblical story of Noah and his 3 sons, Shem, Japheth, and Ham. In the 12 Tribes lexicon, Ham is referred to by his Hebraic name, Cham. While mainstream theologians generally view the story of Noah's curse as an ancient explanation for the later subjugation of the Canaanites, Gene Spriggs and the leadership of the 12 tribes transformed it into a foundational law of racial destiny. In their internal free papers and teaching manuals, they map these 3 sons onto the major races of the world. Shem is identified as the ancestor of the white and Jewish peoples, Japheth as the ancestor of the Asian and Indo-European peoples, and Cham as the ancestor of the black race. By this logic, the curse of Ham is not a historical footnote, but an eternal divine decree that mandates the subservience of black people to their white brothers. This supremacist theology extends even to those the group identifies as the descendants of Shem. While the blessed line of Shem includes the Jewish people, the 12 tribes teaches a virulent form of collective responsibility regarding the death of Christ. They cite Matthew chapter 27 verse 25, "His blood be on us and on our children," to argue that Jewish people as a whole bear an eternal blood guilt for the crucifixion. This teaching serves to strip the Jewish people of their status as God's chosen, allowing the 12 tribes to claim that they alone are the true Israel. In this worldview, the Jewish people are not only responsible for the death of the Messiah, but are also spiritually blinded, making them secondary to the holy members of the community who have been grafted into the true tribal lineage.
The group's internal documents from the late 1980s and early 1990s lay out the philosophy regarding the Chamites with startling bluntness. One teaching from 1988 asserts that the more men try to set Cham free through social movements or political abolition, the worse he becomes in his own soul. It goes on to state that slavery was a marvelous opportunity for black people to be brought to the Americas, as it provided them with the structure and forced labor necessary to make them useful to society. The leadership teaches that black people would not do anything productive without being forced, and that the civil rights movement and the abolition of slavery were actually acts of rebellion against God's natural order. Within the community, this translates into a culture where some members have alleged that slaves are black, and that specific black members are treated as such, often relegated to the most grueling physical labor under the guise of spiritual discipline. This ideology creates a profound and disturbing psychological environment for the black and mixed-race members who join the community. The group actively proselytizes to African Americans, often appearing at festivals or in urban centers with their message of communal love. When a black person joins, they are told they can be freed from the curse of Cham, but only by submitting entirely to the authority of the 12 tribes. In this context, freedom does not mean equality. It means accepting a place of perpetual subservience. They are taught that slavery is over for those who believe, but because the group considers itself the only true body of believers on earth, this freedom is entirely contingent on their continued obedience to the white leadership of the movement.
The psychological toll of this internal hierarchy is perhaps most poignantly illustrated by the childhood of Sanasta Colucci. Born to a white mother and a black father, Colucci entered the group as a child and was immediately confronted with the Chem doctrine. The weight of being told his very skin was a mark of a divine curse was so heavy that as a young boy he would take pieces of tree bark and attempt to scrape his skin, trying to peel away the darkness to find the white skin he believed lay beneath. He wanted to be clean and blessed like the white members of the community. This desperate act of self-mutilation was a direct response to a theology that labeled half of his ancestry as divinely intended for servitude. Despite the inherent racism of these doctrines, the group has occasionally utilized high-ranking black members to reinforce their teachings. Yohanan Abraham, formerly John Stringer, became a vocal proponent of the group's supremacist doctrines. Former members have recounted how Abraham would praise the early Ku Klux Klan and its first Grand Wizard, Nathan Bedford Forrest. Abraham reportedly taught that the KKK, in its original post-Civil War form, had a righteous purpose in maintaining the social order that God intended. For a mixed-race member like Colucci, hearing a black leader extol the virtues of a white supremacist terrorist organization was a moment of profound cognitive dissonance that reinforced the idea that his own identity was something to be suppressed or hated. The racial hierarchy is further solidified by the group's view of the afterlife and the three eternal destinies framework. Within this framework, the racial hierarchy serves as a litmus test for righteousness. For a black person to be considered righteous after death, they must have lived a life of humble service and submission, fulfilling the curse of Ham in a way that is pleasing to God. The servant of servants role is not just a temporary earthly condition. It is a preparation for an eternity of being ruled by the holy nation. This internal culture of supremacy is often shielded from the world through the Rahab principle. Members are taught that the nations are under the control of the evil one and therefore have no right to the truth if that truth would bring persecution upon the group. This tactic has been particularly effective in custody battles, where a non-member parent accuses the group of teaching racism to their child. A vivid example of this occurred in Colorado, involving a black father named Andre Shepard. After his ex-wife joined the 12 tribes and moved into their Manitou Springs compound with their young daughter, Shepherd began to notice disturbing changes in the girl. During his parenting time, his 8-year-old daughter told him that she was Cham and that she had a Cham family. When Shepherd researched the group's teachings and realized his daughter was being taught that her own father's race was cursed to be subservient, he went to court to seek full custody. However, during the legal proceedings, the girl's mother utilized the Rahab principle to present a sanitized version of their beliefs. She testified that the Cham teaching was merely a historical lesson about one of Noah's sons who migrated to Africa, presenting the group as a multicultural community that accepted all races. The judge, lacking access to the group's internal secret documents, dismissed Shepherd's concerns. In her final order, the judge stated that there was no credible evidence that the community was racist, and instead praised the group for its cross-cultural values. For Andre Shepherd, the legal system's failure to see past the peace and love facade left his daughter in an environment where her very identity was being framed as a divine curse. The psychological impact of these teachings extends to the language used within the community. Children are often referred to as Chamites or descendants of Cham if they are black or mixed race. This is not just a label, it is a constant reminder of their perceived spiritual status. Former members have described how this language is used to justify why black members are often assigned more menial or labor-intensive tasks within the community's businesses. While the group claims that work is assigned based on gifting, the reality often reflects the underlying racial hierarchy. The servant of servants doctrine becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, where those labeled as cursed are pushed into roles that reinforce their subservience. The 12 tribes' views on race are also deeply tied to their rejection of modern society. They view the world's attempt at racial equality as a sign of the end times, a manifestation of the lawlessness that they believe precedes the return of the Messiah. They teach that by trying to erase the distinctions between the sons of Noah, the world is inviting chaos and judgment. In their view, true peace can only be found when every person accepts their natural place in the hierarchy. This includes their views on gender, where women are expected to be entirely submissive to their husbands, and their views on homosexuality, which they condemn as a capital offense that warrants death. For the leadership, these teachings are a way to maintain absolute control over a diverse membership. By creating a theological justification for subservience, they ensure that black members remain loyal and obedient, even when faced with treatment that would be considered discriminatory in the outside world. They are told that their struggle is not against the group, but against their own rebellious nature as a descendant of Cham. This spiritual gaslighting makes it incredibly difficult for members to question the authority of the elders or to seek help from the world they have been taught to fear. The Southern Poverty Law Center has classified the 12 tribes as a white supremacist cult precisely because of these hidden doctrines. While the group's public face is one of rustic hospitality, their internal world is one of rigid theological racism. They have created a society that replicates systems of oppression, all while claiming to be the only true manifestation of God's love on earth. This shadow of supremacy hangs over every aspect of their communal life, from the way they raise their children to the way they interact with the nations they hope to eventually rule. Chapter 5: The Long Road Home: Reclaiming Identity After the Cult. The moment of departure from the 12 tribes is rarely a clean break. For those who have spent years, or even their entire lives, within the confines of the community, stepping across the threshold of the compound is less like a walk to freedom and more like being thrust onto the surface of an alien planet. The physical exit is often the easiest part, though even that is frequently met with a gauntlet of psychological and social pressure designed to make the heart fail. When John Post decided to leave the Vermont community in 1999, he didn't just walk out a door. He had to pass through a literal human wall. 15 members of the group, people he had lived with, worked with, and prayed with, stood in his path. They didn't use physical force, but they used a weapon far more potent in the mind of a believer, the prophecy of death. They prayed over him, warning that the moment he stepped outside the protection of the community, he would be vulnerable to the evil one. They told him he would die. This is the standard psychological deterrent used to keep members from straying. The world is framed not just as a place of sin, but as a place of certain destruction. For John, who is deaf and was struggling with his identity as a gay man in a community that viewed both as spiritual failings, the fear was paralyzing. He describes his heart pounding with the absolute conviction that something catastrophic would happen to him the moment he hit the pavement of the public road. His father followed him for a mile, imploring him to turn back, to stay within the safety of the tribe. When the father finally gave up and walked away, John was left in a silence that was more than just his lack of hearing. He was an adult in his early 20s, but he was entering a world for which he had zero preparation. The immediate aftermath of leaving is characterized by a profound and disorienting void. Members who join the 12 tribes surrender everything: their bank accounts, their cars, their social security cards, and even their birth certificates. When they leave, they often do so with nothing but the clothes on their backs and perhaps a few personal photographs. They have no money, no credit history, and no recent references. More importantly, they have no understanding of the basic mechanics of modern life. One survivor described the sensation as being born into an adult body but possessing the life skills of a small child. The first time they see an ATM, a vending machine, or a smartphone, it is a source of confusion and anxiety. One man recounted the poignant experience of standing before an ATM for the very first time on the day he left the community. An adult man who had never once handled his own money or interacted with a digital banking interface. He felt like an alien in his own skin. Reclaiming a legal identity is the first hurdle. Without a birth certificate or a social security card, a survivor essentially does not exist in the eyes of the state. This is often an intentional tactic by the group to make leaving as difficult as possible. Survivors have to navigate the labyrinth of government bureaucracy to prove who they are, a task made harder by the fact that many were given new Hebrew names within the group and have forgotten how to operate under their heathen identities. For children born into the cult, the situation is even more dire. Some may not even have official birth records if they were born in remote communities or if the group failed to report the birth to worldly authorities. The story of Tammy Stern provides a vivid example of the physical and emotional toll of this transition. Raised within the group and moved as a child to their community in Devon, England, Tammy's life was a cycle of labor and ritual. Her breaking point came not from a theological disagreement, but from a workplace injury that exposed the group's neglect. While working with a meat grinder, her fingers were severely injured. In the 12 tribes, such accidents are often viewed as a sign of a bad conscience or a spiritual failure rather than a simple mishap. Tammy felt she received inadequate medical support and was instead pressured to view her pain as a divine correction. This moment of clarity, the realization that the life of love did not extend to her physical safety, fueled her resolve to escape. Her departure required a level of secrecy and coordination that felt like a spy operation. She had managed to keep a phone number given to her by an aunt during a rare visit from outside relatives. When the opportunity arose while she was working at the Yellow Deli, she signaled her aunt, who arrived to whisk her away. But the escape was only the beginning. Tammy had to unlearn a lifetime of conditioning. She had been told that she was special, a part of an elite group hand-picked by God, and that everyone outside was lost and miserable. Tamara Matthew calls this the prison of specialness, the psychological trap where the idea of being elite makes becoming a normal person feel like a traumatic loss of status.
Coming to terms with the fact that she was now just a normal person in a normal world was a massive blow to Tammy's sense of self. She eventually moved to Denver, where she began the long process of rebuilding, eventually enrolling in an art and design college to pursue the very kind of selfish ambition the group had spent years trying to suppress. For those who leave as children or young teenagers, the arrested development is even more pronounced. Alina Anderson left the group at age 14 and now lives in Boulder, Colorado. Her perspective highlights the unique struggle of a child who has never known a world outside the community's rigid structure. At an age when most teenagers are beginning to assert their independence, Alina had to learn how to navigate a society that was entirely foreign to her. For a young teen, the transition isn't just about learning how to use technology. It's about catching up on years of missed social cues, educational milestones, and the basic understanding of how to exist without a collective identity.
For parents like Tamara Matthew, the price of paradise included a crushing weight of guilt. Tamara spent 14 years in the group, raising 4 children within the bubble. When she and her husband finally fled in the middle of the night in 2014, they didn't just leave a house. They left a belief system that had dictated every interaction with their children. Reintegration for them meant facing the reality of the physical discipline they had been told was loving. Outside, Tamara had to look at her children and realize that the discipline she had been conditioned to believe was a divine mandate was actually a form of trauma. She describes the difficulty of learning how to parent without the rod, the confusion of trying to implement a timeout or a conversation when her only frame of reference was physical punishment. A vital part of Tamara's healing came from an unexpected source, her husband. In the aftermath of their departure, he eventually apologized for how he had treated her under the influence of the cult's patriarchal structure. He admitted that if she had found the courage to leave sooner, he would have followed her. This admission highlights the fractured families theme that haunts many survivors, the realization that the group's influence can turn even the closest relationships into tools of control, and that the path to reconciliation is often as long as the path to escape. The psychological impact of this transition is often described as a form of arrested development. Because the group discourages independent thought and critical thinking, survivors often find themselves struggling to make even the simplest decisions. In the community, every aspect of life, from what you eat to who you talk to, is directed by the master through the elders. This micromanagement can reach levels of granular detail that underscore the total erasure of personal autonomy. Former members have described an environment of such extreme control that rules even dictated the use of only 2 sheets of toilet paper. When that rigid structure is removed, the sudden burden of choice can be paralyzing. Survivors often report a persistent fear of retribution. Tamara recalled that for a year after leaving, she lived in a state of constant anxiety, waiting for God to enact some terrible punishment on her family for their rebellion. Every minor stroke of bad luck, a flat tire, a sick child, was viewed through the lens of cult conditioning as a sign of divine anger. Social reintegration is equally challenging. The 12 Tribes teaches that the only true relationships are those within the community. When a member leaves, they are cut off, and those they left behind are discouraged from having any contact with them. This means the survivor loses their entire social support network in a single day. Making new friends in the world feels impossible at first because the survivor has no common ground with their peers. They don't know the popular music, the movies, the political climate, or the social norms that everyone else takes for granted. They often feel like aliens or imposters, fearing that if people knew where they came from, they would be judged or misunderstood. In the digital age, however, survivors are finding new ways to bridge this gap. The Women Survivors of the 12 Tribes Communities Facebook page has become a vital modern support network. It offers a practical method for reclaiming identity, allowing women to share their stories, offer advice on navigating the world, and find the social support that was stripped away the moment they left. For many, this online community is the first place they realize they are not alone in their confusion or their guilt. The process of healing often requires professional therapy, but even this is a hurdle. Survivors have been taught that psychology and psychiatry are worldly philosophies designed to lead people away from God. Learning to trust a therapist, to believe that their thoughts and feelings are valid and not just selfishness, is a major milestone in recovery. They have to untangle the Rahab principle, the habit of lying to authorities that they were taught was a spiritual virtue. This ingrained habit of deception makes building trust with therapists or employers incredibly difficult. They have to unlearn the reflex to hide the truth from anyone they perceive as an outsider. They have to process the public humiliations they endured and the way their consciences were manipulated by the elders. The economic reintegration is perhaps the most practical and persistent struggle. Most survivors leave with zero savings and no professional resume. The years they spent working in the yellow deli or on a construction crew do not translate easily to the modern job market because they have no records of employment, no pay stubs, and no tax history. They have to start at the absolute bottom, often working multiple entry-level jobs just to afford a basic apartment. The contrast is sharp. In the community, they were promised that all their needs would be met and they would never have to worry about money. In the world, they are faced with the harsh reality of individual responsibility and the rat race they were taught to despise. For the children who leave, the transition is a race to catch up. Many are years behind in their education, having been homeschooled in a curriculum that prioritized scripture over science or mathematics. They have to work twice as hard to earn GEDs or to qualify for college. But they also bring with them a unique set of skills. Because they were raised in an environment of constant labor and apprenticeship, many are remarkably disciplined and capable in manual trades. Tamara noted that her children, despite the trauma of their upbringing, became self-sufficient adults and successful business people because they had learned the value of hard work from a very young age. This is the great paradox of the 12 tribes. The very labor that exploited them also gave them a ruggedness that helped them survive the world they were never supposed to enter. Reintegration also means rediscovering joy. In the community, music and dance were ritualized and controlled. Outside, survivors describe the thrill of listening to the radio or going to a concert and realizing they can dance simply because they want to, not because it is a mandatory part of a morning gathering. They learn to celebrate birthdays, not as self-centered events, but as a way to honor their own existence and the fact that they survived. They learned to eat foods that weren't part of the communal diet, and to wear clothes that reflect their own personality, rather than a tribal uniform. Tamara Matthew eventually found her voice through advocacy, using social media platforms like TikTok to share her experiences and warn others. Her videos, which often begin with the stark introduction, "I'm a cult survivor," highlight the small, everyday things that were forbidden: celebrating a birthday, reading a non-12 tribes book, or participating in a sports team. This public sharing is a way of reclaiming the identity that the group tried to erase. By documenting the things we were not allowed to do, she is physically and digitally asserting her right to do them now. She eventually returned to the University of Vermont to finish the degree she had abandoned 16 years earlier, a symbolic closing of the circle that the cult had broken. The mass exodus of the first generation of children born into the cult is a testament to the human desire for autonomy. Many of these young adults leave the moment they become parents themselves, unwilling to inflict the same environment on their own children that they endured. They choose the uncertainty and struggle of the world over the paradise of the community because they realize that the price of that paradise was their own freedom. They are the Stone Kingdom in reverse, chipping themselves away from the community to find their own place in the mountain of humanity. For those still on the outside looking in, like Andre Shepard, the struggle remains a legal and emotional battle to protect the next generation from the same cycle of control. The price of paradise is a debt that survivors continue to pay long after they have left the compound. A cost measured in lost years, fractured families, and the long, slow work of remembering who they were before they were told they belonged to the tribe. Each story of reintegration is a victory over a system that was designed to be inescapable. They have moved from a world of absolute certainty and total control into a world of ambiguity and freedom, and in doing so, they have reclaimed the one thing the 12 tribes could never truly erase, their individual human spirit. As the 12 tribes continues to expand its global network of delis and farms, the question remains whether a community built on the total erasure of the individual can survive the growing chorus of those who have found their voices. Will the Stone Kingdom eventually crumble under the weight of its own secrets, or will it continue to find new ways to adapt to a world that is increasingly aware of the price its members pay?
The 12 tribes began as a search for spiritual authenticity, but evolved into a global network defined by totalistic control. From the rustic charm of the yellow Deli to the rigid theology of the rod and the curse of Cham, the group's survival depends on the total surrender of individual identity and labor. This story highlights the delicate balance between religious freedom and the protection of human rights, illustrating how easily a quest for community can become a system of exploitation. As we look at the Stone Kingdom, we must ask, what is the true cost of a paradise that demands the erasure of the self? The journey of survivors reminds us that the human spirit remains resilient, even in the shadow of absolute authority. Thank you for listening to this exploration of the 12 tribes.